So recently, a deep-sea mining company called Odyssey Marine Exploration, which is based in Florida, won $37.1 million from the Mexican state. The reason? Mexico rejected environmental permits which would have allowed the company to dredge a massive area of Mexico's seabed so that they could mine phosphates. These permits would have given the company the rights to engage in environmentally devastating mining for 50 years. But this was also in conflict with the rights of local populations, including the Puerto Xali Fishing Cooperative, which is made up of 120 fishers who've lived off those waters for generations. The environmental devastation caused by deep-sea mining could have had horrific effects. It could have destroyed local ecosystems, decimated fishing stocks in the areas, both destroying the environment and a way of life for local people.
We need the ocean for our food, for our climate, for our marine biodiversity.
And these local fishers put up a big fight against this mining because they knew it would destroy their area. They lived there for ages. They knew what dredging the seabed would look like. So in response to these, I think, fairly well-founded fears of environmental devastation, the company, Odyssey, who have been previously accused of fraud in 1997, and in a, quote, continuous core campaign of bad faith, deception and deflection for a case in which they essentially stole a bunch of treasure from Spain back in 2012, the company decided to sue Mexico to the tune of $2.36 billion in lost profits. And while they only won a fraction of that initial claim, this case represents a growing problem in international politics: the explosion of investor-state dispute settlements, or ISDSs, as I might refer to them throughout. So, investor-state dispute settlements are essentially a mechanism whereby companies can sue states for lost profits if a state has signed an investment treaty and then takes actions which affect a company's profits.
Canadian and US mining companies are suing the Colombian government in a secret trade court for $16.5 billion for protecting nature.
They have been around for a fairly long time and are embedded within both bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. But since the 1990s, the number of claims and treaties with ISDS provisions have exploded, and the rate of this explosion seems only to be increasing. Over the past decade, the number of these cases where corporations are suing states has more than doubled, with at least 60 new cases started in 2023. And for defenders of ISDSs, these provisions are essential to ensure stable conditions for investment and therefore encourage easy flows of foreign direct investment across the world, leading to increased development and poverty alleviation. They are required to prevent unjust market distortions and interventions which apparently elevate local capital, local markets, over the foreign direct investment. Any number of events or the presence of regulations can be cited as justifications for a lawsuit, from pesky labour laws to environmental regulations to health regulations to human rights regulations, or even just a change in a country's regime. So imagine, for example, if a country which had previously signed a bunch of trade agreements with global oil corporations suddenly elected a progressive, or God forbid, even a socialist government, who wanted to nationalise energy production to prevent extraction of profits and energy to the global north and maybe pursue a more environmentally conscious platform. In such an instance, the oil companies would be able to take this state to one of these notoriously obscure arbitration panels and sue them to the tune of billions in lost profits. And in fact, this scenario is one which defenders of ISDSs have explicitly used to defend them.
I'll take an extreme example in Venezuela. Everybody knows what's happening in Venezuela, but you can take other countries as well, which at one time in their history were very friendly to business, and then they turn, the government changes, and they become very unfriendly. And so this arbitration mechanism is meant to provide some certainty over changes in government policy over a period of time.
So why is ISDS so controversial?
Well, it's controversial for two reasons. One, it's an acronym. It sounds kind of bad, like NAFTA sounds bad to people.
Apparently, the biggest issue that economic orthodoxy of the Peterson Institute sees is with the acronym. It's always funny to get an insight into what the actual economic orthodoxy sees as the problem, because they just don't seem to be able to grasp the actual issues, their treatment of things is so foreign to me, so alien, so unable to deal with underlying realities and question core concepts. It's kind of disturbing. And states have lost billions of dollars to oil companies through these arbitration arrangements. In 2012, Occidental Petroleum won the biggest award in history at that time, which, after an appeal from the host state Ecuador, was reduced to only a cool $1.77 billion. In 2014, Venezuela, the country in the Peterson Institute's cute hypothetical, was ordered to pay $1.6 billion to ExxonMobil, while again in Mexico, the US-based construction giant Vulcan won $1.5 billion after the government refused to renew their mining contracts after immense environmental damage. Moreover, states are often subject to multiple cases at once. For example, Colombia has had 26 such cases brought against it over the past 10 years, including by mining giants BHP and Glencore. As of last year, Colombia's pending ISDS claims exceed $13 billion. That's equivalent to 13% of the government's annual budget. One of the reasons that the use of these ISDSs has increased in recent years is that a cottage industry of financial backers has sprung up to fund them. A recent investigation by The Guardian found that at least $120 billion worth of public money has been awarded to international firms, with at least $84 billion awarded to fossil fuel companies. But you have to remember, with 31% of all cases where payouts or settlements were made, the award size wasn't disclosed, meaning the real figures are likely to be much bigger. So $84 billion for oil companies, $120 billion overall, is likely a significant underestimation. And this is a huge amount of money to be sloshing around, and as such, it has obviously attracted bottom feeders. Hedge funds and investors have been increasingly funding these suits in exchange for a share of the payouts. Have you been in an accident in work? Have you done an oil spill? Have you had your contract to extract wealth and minerals from a global south state scuppered by a new socialist regime? Well, come to us. No win, no fee. We will get you billions in compensation and lost profits. And hey, maybe these pesky governments will think twice before they refuse a contract next time. Come to us. We're scum. So while there's still no necessity to disclose third-party funding in many investment treaties, we can be confident that investment in these measures is significant and expanding and has consequences which can be reasonably described as fucked. For example, half of all third-party funded cases were launched by investors from the US, Britain and Canada, and more than half relate to fossil fuel and mining. And more than 75% of these cases were against global south states. So the intersecting strands of global neocolonialism and climate catastrophe are cartoonishly clear here. Global North finance provides the funds to fossil fuel companies and mining corporations to sue global south states who cancel contracts on environmental grounds. And while recent changes in various ISDS standards are set to introduce new mechanisms whereby fossil fuel investment protection can be excluded from treaties, these are opt-in only. And this means, of course, that there's going to be an immense amount of pressure on states seeking investment not to opt in. And even if states do opt in, such exclusions only take place in stages and over a number of years. With climate catastrophe upon us, it's so hot here, I'm dying. It's so hot. With climate catastrophe upon us, such a lackluster mechanism is obviously, at the very least, inadequate. Something else to consider regarding such apparent innovations which seek to reform and in so doing legitimise ISDS mechanisms is that they would still have no ability to exclude cases like Odyssey's suit against Mexico. Odyssey was mining phosphates for use in US agriculture, not fossil fuels. The environmental destruction to the seabed and the potential loss of fisheries would not be considered part of such exemptions. And moreover, as I talked about in my video on green colonialism, energy companies are increasingly utilising extractive neocolonial methods developed in the fossil fuel industry for new green projects. Local populations might have solid environmental grounds to oppose lithium mining or solar farms using local water supplies.
The community says more lithium mines will deplete the little water they have.
If
they extract the lithium from the salt flats, everything will die. Our water will dry up because the water comes from the same place.
And states have good reason to nationalise energy production so their land isn't just used for European or American energy security. But none of these concerns would be legitimate cause for exclusion under ISDS mechanisms, and so such states are disciplined to maintain the neocolonial extractive status quo with the threat of massive billion-dollar fines hanging over their head like the sword of fucking Damocles. Just think about it. You're a state who needs to develop its local infrastructure, its local industry, and the only way to do it is by these massive oil companies, these massive energy companies. What are you going to do? You have to sign an investment treaty to attract these investors to develop your infrastructure, and in so doing trap you in a system whereby you can't get back the energy which is being siphoned off. You can't properly consider the environmental destruction of particular actions unless you risk billions in dollars of suits. You're trapped in extraction. But still, defenders of these mechanisms will still claim that the ability of investors to sue states is just a simple, obvious necessity. You need it to maintain smooth flows of capital.
This arbitration mechanism is meant to provide some certainty over changes in government policy over a period of time.
And it's actually kind of amazing to read academic lawyers discuss ISDSs because they talk about concepts that I would understand as obviously contentious and obviously hiding a whole bunch of like real world social contradictions and conflicts. But they talk about them as if they have an innate and obvious legitimacy. They don't even question the legitimacy of these concepts. Now, obviously the notion that free-flowing capital and the smooth operations of international investment is not a neutral position. It's clearly one which comes with a lot of values added on. I was reading an article by an academic lawyer who responded to criticisms of ISDSs by arguing that some of the most famous ISDS cases used to illustrate the alleged abuse of the system are, on closer examination, no more than a tribunal determining that a measure was in reality protectionist in nature, designed to protect the local market at the expense of the foreign investor, and was therefore found to be at odds with the international commitments of the host state. ISDS does not prohibit host states from regulating foreign investors. It merely examines whether host state measures are treaty compliant. For example, measures driven by populism or protectionism. Even in the rare case where this charge would seem to be true, it would only be so in cases where the rule of law, equal protection, and due process, substantive and procedural, were not commonplace or at a minimum were not applied in a coherent fashion. So I find this quote fascinating, not least because the author is, one, the guy who represented tobacco giants when they sued the UK for trying to impose plain packaging on cigarette packets.
In Webster's dictionary, defines evil as profoundly immoral.
Great lad, clearly. And two, because he frames critiques of ISDSs as myths, to which he is providing the objective, factual response. But also, because his fastidious factfulness obscures a deep sea of political assumptions about the world. Assumptions which are, like ISDSs themselves, neoliberal and neocolonial at their core. For Reiss, criticisms of ISDSs can only be legitimate if the system is being abused. That is, if the rules of the game are not being followed. But, as he argues, the alleged abuse of the system are no more than a tribunal determining that a measure was designed to protect the local market. There's no questioning of whether mechanisms which privilege investor finance might exist within a network of, say, centuries of extractive colonial dynamics which already privilege global finance at the expense of local global south economies.
Well, we're quite happy to use the domestic courts, but we're not so happy, or our business firms are not so happy about using the domestic courts. I'll take an extreme example in Venezuela.
There's no consideration that when states like Colombia are being sued for 13% of their yearly budget, that they might be pressured into accepting harmful extractive conditions. Rather, the distortions of the market, populism and protectionism, are assumed to be the inherent evils to be institutionally blocked. And this is, at its core, just an incredible example of neoliberal common sense projected as facts of life. Never has this lawyer considered that even if all the rules of a game are followed, the game itself can still be rigged.
And more importantly, working in games, no one ever wins a giant-ass panda.
To get into the theory, and we've not done a neoliberal video in a while, but we're back at it. We're back at some classic JTD fucking content here. One of the core components of neoliberalism is the establishment of a strong institutional framework to maintain the structures of global markets, and as the radical scholar Coleman argues, to discipline post-colonial states into accepting a new neocolonial dynamic of global north investment and extraction. So, if a state needs foreign investment to develop its economy in the context of several hundred years of extraction and underdevelopment, it is also compelled via economic power and institutional dynamics to accept terms which force it to leave local and international business to direct competition. Obviously, when global north capital comes to town, it does so with an outsized wallet and way more power than local capital.
What we see far too often is business interests coming in, illegally invading those lands, indigenous people essentially being chased off, sometimes extremely violently, and that forest is then lost.
Odyssey mining versus local fisheries. The apparent equality of market competition obscures obvious power imbalances, and the attempts to combat such power imbalances which facilitate wealth extraction are, in Reiss's view, protectionism. So, to borrow Marx's phrase, between equal rights, force decides. And consistent with neoliberal ideals, these institutional dynamics have to be, as far as possible, removed from any democratic engagement. As Hayek warned in The Road to Serfdom, collective democratic control over the economy was not just an unacceptable distortion of the smooth operations of the market, but the route to totalitarian collectivism akin to Nazi Germany or Stalin's USSR. So when Reiss argues that local states breaking the terms of trade treaties are frequently the result of populism, what he is really gesturing towards is an unacceptable amount of local democratic power being used to try and rein in the power of international capital. This is also one of the reasons why these ISDSs are so secretive and distant. Such attacks on democratic power over the economy is one of neoliberalism's core authoritarian features. A country electing a government on a mandate to nationalise energy or mining production cannot be allowed to interfere with the smooth functioning of international capital.
I could see Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. He was looking at me with, eyes that felt like laser beams. And he gets the floor and he said, one sentence, which is the one that I'm going to leave you with. Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Got it?
In Odyssey's case against the Mexican government, representatives of the Puerto Chale fishing cooperative were not allowed to engage with the proceedings. While Odyssey could pursue legal action on the grounds of their loss of profits, local fisheries were unable to present their case that mining would devastate the local environment and destroy their way of life. It's such a clear example of how following the rules of the game result in clearly rigged results. Local actors are sidelined due to massive power imbalances, obscured by a cold institutional system, while any democratic engagement to try and rein in the power of capital is framed as unjust, populist protectionism, and must therefore be completely sidelined. For the lawyers, this is just the rule of law, but the rule of law is just another concept used uncritically by such lawyers to obscure the inherently unjust, unequal global institutional framework. As radical scholar Lara Montesinos Coleman argues, the rule of law as a framework informed legal visions of neoliberal thinkers, according to which state regulations to protect socio-economic rights, e.g. through wealth distribution or welfare provision, is said to undermine a natural, merely technical legal order protected by courts as neutral solvers of private conflicts arising in a free market. Efforts to fix the meaning of rule of law in these terms at a global level have been fundamental to the rise of neoliberalism. Investor-state dispute settlements are undoubtedly part of this technical legal order, which attempts to project a supposedly neutral way of dealing with conflicts in the apparently free market beneath the veneer of legal jargon and common sense. These mechanisms are an increasingly important feature of maintaining global neocolonial extraction and upholding the global neoliberal regime. I'm not going to suggest any easy policy fixes to these mechanisms because, as the argument I've made hopefully demonstrates, these are merely technical support structures for a more fundamental global capitalist order. Tinkering around the edges of such mechanisms won't solve the underlying issue. Instead, politically, we need to highlight things like ISDSs as a particularly egregious example of how this system mechanically operates. We can use them to legitimise the expulsion or disciplining of global North capital by global South states, and finally, we see how they attack democratic control of the economy and understand that, as radicals, our aim is to take back the impersonal technocratic control of the economy and place it under the democratic management of the global proletariat. People have been fishing on the oceans for generations should have a voice in how those oceans are used, not be excluded from any decision-making process. So if you're complaining about investor-state dispute settlements in the future, which I know you all will be after watching this video, make sure you're not bamboozled by lawyers invoking the rule of law. Just sit back and imagine a life without listening to lawyers.
Can you imagine a world without lawyers? Oh.
Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I thought it was quite an interesting one, slightly different from a lot of some of the other stuff that we've done so far, a bit of a focus in on a specific policy. If you enjoyed it, please think about liking, subscribing, sharing the video, and if you can, sign up to Patreon or give a one-off donation via PayPal or Ko-fi. Patrons, $10 and up patrons, get their names read out in the credits, which I'll do in a second. $5 and up get access to a Discord server, and everyone who's like $2 and up gets like early access to the videos, video scripts, other writing that I do, and a bunch of stuff that's already there. Some music as well that's on the Patreon, if anyone's interested. Right, so with that, what I'm stumbling over my words here. I will read out all the names of the $10 and up patrons. We have Demo Squid, Dying of Thirst, Soval Hayes, Daniel Swing, Errol Grey T, Bonnie, Joshua Moldenhauer, Nina G Public Relations, FD Signifier, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Anita Anispe, Ellis Wren, S, Hey Joe, Cameron Blakemore, Paul, Jacob Quinn Schenker, Mason Colbert, Alex, Tim, Unoriginal Name, Rachel Ann, Melanie Estes, Laum, Xander Corvus, Via Westfall, Jack, TV Skyen, Christopher Poff, Mar Gussie, Tom Price, Kate Soiree, Esoteric Fictionalism, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Duncan Skinner, Niels Avocard, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Aga Ghost, Barney Carroll, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Nelly Zacheva, J. Fraser Cartwright, Aaron, Tamash Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. And yeah, so like I say, please give it a like, give it a share. If you're another YouTuber watching this far, share on the community tab is extremely helpful. And if you can, sign up to Patreon. Oh, fuck it. We're all trying to survive here. We're all doing our best. Yeah, cheers, and I'll see you next time. Love you. Bye.